The storm had been building for 3 days before anyone in Ridgecrest took it seriously, and by the time the second night swallowed the last visible roofline, it was too late for serious to mean anything at all. But that moment, the 12th morning, the silence arriving like a verdict, came later. Everything that mattered came later. What mattered first was a woman standing at the edge of a sandstone cliff in the spring of 1878, reading rock the way other people read faces and deciding that what she saw there was worth the rest of her life. Eleanor Stone was 43 years old when she first looked up at the south wall of Eagle River Canyon and felt something shift behind her sternum. Not excitement, not ambition, but recognition. The sensation was specific and quiet, the way a word you've been reaching for finally surfaces. She had felt it twice before, once when her father first placed a hand chisel in her palm and closed her fingers around the handle, and once much later when Samuel Stone had looked at her across a crowded public reading room in Philadelphia and asked without any social preamble whatsoever whether she thought limestone or sandstone was the more honest material. She had married him 14 months after that question. She had never expected to feel that particular sensation again, and certainly not standing in the thin Colorado air, with trail dust on her skirt, in a town full of strangers below her who had already decided she was either to be pitied or ignored. The overhang was 60 feet above the valley floor. It jutted from the cliff face like a shelf a giant had carved and then forgotten, 15 feet deep, and better than 20 feet wide, the sandstone above it, solid and dark with age. The rock beneath the overhang was a different color than the exposed face Louetta protected, telling her without words that it had not seen weather in a very long time. She pressed her palm flat against it. The stone was cool and faintly rough, the grain running horizontal in long, confident lines. She closed her eyes. Her father had taught her to listen to rock through her hands before she was old enough to understand why, and what she heard now was the same thing she had heard in the walls of the courthouse he built in Lancaster County when she was 9 years old. The same thing she had heard in the foundation stones of the Methodist Hospital on Broad Street, whose plans she had drafted at age 26 under her father's name, because her own name would have cost the contract. She heard permanence. She heard a structure that had already decided to stand and was simply waiting for someone to understand the terms. Samuel came up beside her after she had been still for what he later described as an uncomfortably long time, long enough that he had begun to suspect she had entered some kind of geological trance. He had learned in their 9 years of marriage that this particular quality of her silence was not absence but concentration, not blankness but a fullness so complete it left no room for ordinary expression. He stood beside her and looked up at what she was looking at and tried to see what she saw. He was a patient man and a genuinely curious one, and he had built a life around the habit of studying things he did not yet understand. Her voice, when it came, was so ordinary in its directness that he almost missed the weight of it. There she said, and when he asked what she meant, she said it without turning her head, in the house. Not a house, not our house, the house. As though it had already been there for 1,000 years and she was simply naming it. He looked at the overhang. He looked at the narrow goat trail that climbed toward it in switchbacks so tightened a man would have to turn sideways in places. He looked at the sheer drop to the valley floor and the creek 60 feet below, a thin silver thread between cottonwood roots. He thought about a number of practical objections and then set them aside, not because they were wrong, but because he had learned that practical objections offered to Eleanor Stone in moments of geological revelation were like arguing directions with a compass. They had arrived in Ridgecrest 3 days prior, coming west on a combination of rail and hired wagon from Denver, drawn by the silver boom the way everyone else was drawn, except for entirely different reasons. Eleanor had no interest in silver. She had interest in the dramatic stratigraphy of the canyon walls in the layered sandstone that she had read about in survey reports filed by government geologists in the years following the war, reports that described cliff formations in the Colorado high country that bore resemblance to the ancient cliff dwellings documented in the Southern Canyon structures built by people who had vanished centuries before anyone thought to write their history down, but who had, in the time they existed, solved a problem that modern architecture kept failing to solve. They had built with the earth rather than on top of it. They had let the landscape be the structure rather than something to be overcome by structure. Eleanor had been thinking about this for 3 years, ever since she found her father's last notebook. in the bottom of his tool chest 6 weeks after his funeral. Duncan Stone had been a stonemason of the first order, the kind of man whose knowledge of rock was not technical, but intimate, accumulated over 40 years of working in quarries and on scaffolding, and in the cold silence of half-finished buildings before the crews arrived. He had worked Philadelphia limestone until he knew every seam of it had laid foundation stones that would outlast everyone who ever walked across the floors above them, had built courthouses and libraries in one small church in Lancaster County that sat on a hillside as naturally as if it had grown there. He had done all of this, and then in the last year of his life, alone and quieter than usual, he had read everything he could find about the ancient peoples of the American Southwest who had carved their homes directly into canyon walls. The notebook was not extensive. Duncan Stone had never been a writing man, but on the last page in a hand that showed the tremor he had hidden from Eleanor, during his final months he had written, "They understood what we have forgotten. The earth is not a foundation, the earth is the house." Eleanor had read those two sentences standing at the workbench in his shop with the smell of stone dust still in the air, and she had not been able to set them down since. They had traveled with her through the remainder of the grief, through the months of settling his affairs and closing the shop and teaching mathematics and natural science to young women at a school on Walnut Street, whose administrators valued her precision, but would not under any circumstances consider her for a position with any authority over construction or design. They had traveled with her through the long conversations with Samuel in their parlor on winter evenings when she had begun to articulate, slowly and with many corrections, what she thought she wanted to do with whatever years remained to her. They had traveled with her on the train west, folded inside the cover of her own working notebook, two sentences in her father's hand that she intended to spend the rest of her life proving true. The land's office in Ridgecrest occupied a single room above the general store, accessible by an exterior staircase that someone had built without accounting for the angle of the afternoon sun, so that in summer it became briefly unusable. Harold Finch kept the office a man of 55 with a methodical quality that manifested as a commitment to recording everything in a hand so precise it looked typeset. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had processed a great many land claims and had developed over the years a taxonomy of applicants organized loosely by the likelihood that their claim would end in catastrophe. Eleanor Stone, describing the section of South Cliff Face she wished to purchase, fell into a category he had not previously needed. He asked her in the careful way of a man trying to phrase concern without condescension, whether she had considered that the terrain she was describing would make construction essentially impossible for any purpose he could imagine. She told him in the equally careful way of a woman who had been managing other people's imagination for her entire professional life, that she was not interested in purposes he could imagine. He looked at her for a moment over the top of his spectacles. She looked back. He recorded the transaction. $18 for the full section of South Cliff, face above the canyon floor land, assessed at zero agricultural value, zero mining potential, zero residential suitability. He dated the paper and pressed his seal and handed it to her, and then because he was not unkind, and he had noticed the drop in the trail and the sheer indifferent face of the rock, he told her that if she fell, they would not be able to get her back in time. She told him that if she built it correctly, she would not fall. In the corner of the room, having arrived 20 minutes earlier to sign the quarterly renewal of his mineral extraction contracts, Cornelius Ashworth stood with a ledger under one arm and said nothing. He was a large man, not in the aggressive way of men who use their size consciously, but in the settled way of men who have never been required to make themselves smaller. He had come to Colorado in 1875 with $40,000 of inherited capital and the conviction that the silver deposits in Eagle River Canyon represented an opportunity that rewarded decisive movement over careful analysis. He had been correct. He owned controlling interest in 3 of the 6 active mines in the valley, held lease agreements on most of the productive land along the canyon floor, and was completing construction on a house that was intended to make visible to anyone who cared to look the distance between his station and everyone else's. The house was 3 stories of red cedar imported from Oregon, with glass windows shipped from Chicago and marble fireplace surrounds from Vermont quarries, and it was costing him $12,000, and he wanted every person in Ridgecrest to know that number. He watched Eleanor Stone collect her deed and walk out of the office, and he felt something that he did not examine carefully enough to name. It was not the contempt he would perform publicly that evening at the saloon. It was something more restless than contempt, closer in texture to the feeling a man gets when he watches someone do something that violates a rule he thought was universal. He had built his entire understanding of the world on a principle that money properly deployed produced correct results, correct buildings, correct outcomes, correct status. A woman spending $18 on a rock face to build a dwelling for cliff swallows should have registered as simply ridiculous. Instead, it registered as something he would need to keep an eye on, and he was not sure why. And that uncertainty was its own small irritation. By nightfall, the story had traveled every room in town. Ridgecrest in the spring of 1878 was a place of about 340 souls in various stages of extracting wealth from the earth or from the people who were extracting wealth from the earth, and it ran on information the way a machine runs on fuel, not because the people were gossipy in any small-minded sense, but because in an isolated mountain valley, other people's decisions were genuinely relevant data. The stonecutter woman, as she was immediately called, had purchased a section of cliff face for the price of a good pair of work boots and intended to carve a dwelling into it. The story lost nothing in the retelling. By the time it reached the second saloon, it had acquired dramatic detail, including the speculation that she intended to dangle washing from the ledge like some kind of domestic flag. Cornelius Ashworth's public response delivered to an audience of mind speculators and assayers at the larger of the two saloons was crafted for maximum entertainment. He proposed a wager of $500 against the stonecutter woman surviving her first winter in whatever hole she managed to scratch into the cliff before the cold drove her back to civilization. The laughter was immediate and extended. No one took the other side of the bet. The name that attached itself to the project within 48 hours was the Swallow's Nest, which began as mockery and would remain without anyone consciously deciding to change its meaning long after mockery had become something else entirely. Clara Ashworth was present at one of the ladies' social gatherings 3 days after Eleanor's arrival, when Margaret Dougherty proposed formally excluding the stonecutter woman from the Thursday sewing circle on the grounds that someone who intended to live like a cliff bird was not the kind of person whose company reflected well on the group's standing. Clara did not propose this. Clara did not object to it either. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the other women agree and said nothing, and if there was something behind her expression that a more careful observer might have called discomfort, it passed unremarked. Clara had been the acknowledged social leader of Ridgecrest's small female establishment for 3 years, not because she sought the role, but because she had the largest house and the most money and the particular kind of polished manners that read in a frontier mining town as natural authority. She understood that her position depended on certain structures remaining intact, and those structures depended on certain distinctions being maintained, and a woman who built houses in cliffs disturbed the distinctions in ways that were difficult to articulate, but easy to feel. The two hardware suppliers in Ridgecrest arrived at their refusal independently and announced it almost simultaneously, which suggested either coordination or a shared instinct about the kind of precedent they did not wish to set. Eleanor received the first refusal without visible reaction, and the second with the same expression, and then she went back to the boarding house room where she and Samuel were staying, temporarily sat down at the small desk by the window, and wrote out a supply order addressed to a materials company in Denver with whom she had corresponded before leaving Philadelphia. The order was detailed and precise and would cost 15% more than the local price and arrive 3 weeks later than she would have preferred. She sealed the envelope and went to post it and did not discuss the refusals with Samuel that evening, not because she was hiding them, but because she had already processed the emotion they required and moved on to logistics. Samuel knew anyway. He had a gift for reading the particular quality of her efficiency, which intensified in direct proportion to how much she was not saying. He also had a gift for choosing, in those moments between asking and leaving her the space to address it in her own time. He chose space. What he did do that same evening was visit the small lending library maintained by the Methodist Church in a back room off the vestry and spend 2 hours with every volume they had that touched on geology or natural philosophy or the construction practices of earlier peoples in the American continent. He came back with 2 books tucked under his arm and a specific look on his face that Eleanor, watching him cross the room, recognized as the look he got when he had found a thread worth following. One of the books was a geological survey report from the Hayden expedition, dense with formation data and stratigraphic maps of the Colorado high country. The other was a natural history volume with a chapter on the canyon architecture of the ancient cliff-dwelling cultures of the Southwest, their construction methods, their orientation principles, their apparent understanding of solar angles and thermal mass. Samuel read both books cover to cover over the following week, making notes in his small, precise hand in the margins of a blank notebook he had brought from Philadelphia specifically for this purpose. He was not a builder. He had no illusions about becoming one. But he could read and he could organize what he read, and he had already noticed sitting in that overhang with Eleanor on the afternoon she first saw it, that the angle of the late-day sun struck the south-facing wall at a degree that suggested something worth measuring. The purchase of Seder came about practically. They needed a means of moving materials up the trail, and the alternatives were hiring labor they could not yet afford on a sustained basis or carrying everything themselves, which would have doubled the construction timeline. Cedar was a bay quarter horse of about 12 years, steady-tempered, and narrow enough through the shoulders to navigate the switchbacks without difficulty, purchased from a departing prospector who was going back to Ohio and needed the transaction completed before his wagon left. Eleanor examined the horse's hooves and legs with the same systematic attention she applied to rock formations, declared him sound, and paid $40. Cedar would prove over the following months to be among the most reliable participants in the entire project. Construction began in June of 1878 on a morning cool enough that Eleanor's breath fogged slightly as she drove the first test bore into the sandstone with a long iron rod she had ordered from the same Denver supplier as the rest of the materials. The bore test was not drama, it was data. She worked it systematically across 11 points on the underhang and the rear wall of the overhang, recording the resistance at each point in her notebook, cross-referencing the feel of the stone against what her hands had learned from 40 years of indirect practice. What she found confirmed what she had suspected. The outer surface of the formation was softer than it appeared, eroded by centuries of freeze-thaw cycling, but 3 to 4 inches in the composition changed. The interior stone was denser by 40%, at minimum the kind of sandstone that had been compressed by its own weight for long enough that it had taken on properties closer to limestone. She could cut into it cleanly. She could go 12, possibly 15 feet deep without structural risk. The overhang above would protect the excavation from weather during construction and from snow indefinitely afterward. The south orientation would put direct winter sunlight through the planned window openings for several hours each day, even at the lowest solar angles of December and January. She closed her notebook and picked up the hand chisel and began. The rhythm of the work settled into her body within the first week. She was not a small woman, and she was not soft from years of indoor teaching. She had maintained the upper body strength of someone who spent large parts of her life with a hammer in her hand, had continued working with stone on her own time through all the years when she could not do it professionally, had rebuilt the back steps of their Philadelphia house in limestone on a Saturday in 1874, while Samuel held a lamp and asked questions. But this was sustained work at a scale she had not attempted, and the first 2 weeks left her exhausted in the specific deep way that comes from recruiting muscles back from long underuse. She worked through it. She had a functional attitude toward pain that had nothing to do with toughness in the performative sense and everything to do with the engineering principle that load-bearing requires stress. Samuel's role in the first months was support in the most literal sense, carrying stone chips down the trail in a canvas bag they emptied at the base of the cliff, operating the small pulley system they rigged for moving heavier materials up, keeping Cedar watered and fed, maintaining a supply of the food that Eleanor forgot to eat when she was absorbed in calculation. He observed everything and asked questions when she had bandwidth to answer them, and wrote down what she said. He was, by his own private assessment, approximately as useful as a well-organized secretary, and this assessment bothered him more than he let Eleanor see. The change came in November when the first real cold of autumn drove the construction work to shorter daily windows and gave Samuel long evenings with his accumulated notebooks and the geological texts in a problem he had been turning over for weeks. The overhang would divert falling snow effectively. Any precipitation would land 15 feet in front of the entrance rather than against the door. But water was a separate issue. The sandstone above the overhang was porous. During spring melt and summer rainstorms, water would percolate down through the formation, and without management, it would find its way into the interior. Eleanor knew this and had planned for drainage channels cut into the floor. Samuel had a different idea. He had been thinking about the ancient cliff dwellings, and specifically about one detail in the natural history text that described how several of the canyon structures appeared to have been designed not merely to tolerate water infiltration, but to collect it. The porous sandstone acted as a natural filter. Water that entered the formation at the top emerged at lower levels, having passed through enough stone to run clear and cold, and largely free of surface contamination. What he sketched out over several evenings was a collection system, a series of shallow channels cut into the rear wall of the excavation at a specific angle converging on a collection basin cut deeper into the stone, the whole thing designed to capture the filtered water and store it rather than drain it away. He presented the sketch to Eleanor on a Sunday morning with the careful neutrality of a man who had prepared himself for a technical objection. She took the paper and studied it for a long time without speaking. She turned it and studied it from the other direction. She asked two specific questions about the channel angle and the basin depth, and he gave her the calculations he had worked out, which she checked in her head and corrected in one place by 4 degrees. Then she looked at the drawing again and said in the voice she used when something genuinely surprised her, "My father never thought of this." Samuel understood this was the highest compliment she had available, and he felt something settle in his chest that he had not known was unsettled. The winter of 1878 and into 1879 brought weather that was difficult without being extreme, the kind of mountain winter that kills preparation failures, but rewards them without grandeur. Eleanor adjusted the work pace to account for daylight and temperature, moving the major excavation to the middle hours, and using the early and late periods for measurement planning and the precise work of smoothing surfaces that would become the interior walls. Samuel managed the supply chain, and the animals, and the food, and kept his notebooks. They ate meals in the partial excavation sitting on stone that still smelled of fresh-cut rock, which has a clean mineral quality unlike anything else, and talked about the work with the specific pleasure of people whose professional and domestic lives have fused completely. The first serious crisis came in March of 1879, on a night that dropped to temperatures the locals described as a late-season anomaly, and Eleanor's thermometer recorded as 27 below zero Fahrenheit. She heard it before dawn, not a crash, but a sound somewhere between a crack and a groan, the sound of stone under sudden thermal stress. She was up and out with the lantern before Samuel had registered what woke him moving along the overhang, faced with the light held close to the stone, running her free hand across surfaces she knew by touch as well as by sight. She found the fracture in the eastern edge of the overhang shelf, a new crack running roughly 18 inches along the horizontal grain of a section that had appeared uniformly solid. The crack was not structural in the sense of imminent failure, but it was in the wrong place, and it was new, and standing there in the dark with the cold metal of the lantern handle in her grip. Eleanor Stone felt for the first time the specific fear of having been wrong in a way that could not be undone. She did not wake Samuel. She stood in the cold for an hour and examined the crack from every angle her lantern could illuminate, and thought about what she knew about sandstone, fracture propagation, and thermal cycling, and the difference between a crack that runs along the grain and a crack that runs against it. This one ran along the grain, which meant it was following a plane of weakness that had always been there, had been there since the formation was deposited, had simply not been stressed at this angle before, which meant the overhang had been carrying a fault she had not detected, which meant either she had missed something fundamental or the stone had been waiting to show her something she could not have found from the outside. She went back inside and got her smallest bore rod and worked in the dark for 2 hours, probing behind the fracture line, listening to what the resistance told her. What it told her by the time the sky was beginning to lighten in the east was that behind the fractured surface layer was a band of material with a completely different character, harder, denser, almost granitic in its composition, the kind of intrusive formation that occurred when ancient heat had moved through sedimentary rock and left something more durable behind. The crack had not revealed weakness. The crack had revealed where the real structure began. The overhang was not fragile at the fracture point. The overhang was at the fracture point, anchored to something considerably more solid than she had calculated for. She told Samuel about this over coffee as the sun came up, sitting in the half-finished main chamber, with their backs against a wall that was still rough from the chisel. She told it carefully and completely, including the hour of fear in the dark, before she understood what she was looking at. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So the house told you where it was strongest." She had not thought of it in those terms, but she understood immediately that he was right, and the precision of it stayed with her. The reinforcement work took 3 weeks and changed the design in 2 specific ways that made the final structure better than the original plan. She did not tell anyone in Ridgecrest about the fracture, not from pride, but from an accurate assessment of how the information would be used by people who were already looking for evidence that the project was foolish. By June of 1879, the excavation of the main chamber was complete. By late July, the sleeping room had been cut and smoothed and fitted with the oak window frame that had arrived on the supply wagon from Denver, slightly warped from the journey and requiring 2 hours of adjustment before it seated correctly. The storage chamber beyond the short connecting passage was finished in August cedars section, carved wide enough for the horse to stand and turn comfortably, with a low manger cut directly into the stone and a drain channel that carried wastewater to the outer edge of the overhang. The water collection system Samuel had designed went in during the first week of August. Eleanor cut the channels herself, working from his measurements, correcting, as she went, where the stone's natural grain suggested a slightly different angle than the plan had specified. The collection basin was deeper than Samuel had originally drawn. She took it down another 8 inches after the stone, at the planned depth, proved less dense than the surrounding material, a decision that increased the storage capacity by 30%. When they tested it with buckets of water carried up from the creek, the system worked precisely as he had calculated, the water running clear after passing through 8 inches of sandstone and collecting in the basin at a steady rate. The total expenditure came to $234.18 for the land, $34 for tools and bore equipment, $156 for window glass and oak framing and iron hardware, and the roofing material for cedars, Section 26 for the 2 seasonal laborers, men from the mining crews who worked with Eleanor on the heaviest removal work during 3 separate weeks, when the volume of displaced stone exceeded what 2 people and a horse could manage. The laborers did not refuse to work for her. Working for pay in a mine offered no particular basis for social discrimination, and Eleanor paid fair wages and gave clear instruction and did not require anyone to pretend the work was something other than what it was. On the evening of the last day of August 1879, Eleanor and Samuel sat on the ledge outside the completed entrance as the sun went down behind the western peaks and the valley below filled with the particular blue shadow that preceded mountain dark. The work was done. The chamber behind them was finished in the way that good stonework is finished, not decorated, not ornamented, but complete in itself, every surface intentional, every angle the result of a decision that had understood what it was deciding. The stone held the day's warmth from within its own mass, not aggressively, but steadily releasing it slowly as the air outside cooled. The collection basin in the rear wall held 12 gallons of clean water. The window framing caught the last horizontal light and turned it copper. Ashworth's house below them was brilliant white in its new paint, 3 stories visible above the surrounding structures, the glass windows reflecting the final sunlight like signals. From the ledge, Eleanor and Samuel could see the entire valley, the single main street, the 2 saloons with their lamps already lit, the church steeple, the assay office, the boarding houses. They could see the lights coming on in the small wooden houses as families prepared their evening meals, burning through wood at the rate that mountain winters required, sealing their window gaps with rags and praying the walls held. Samuel filled 2 cups from their coffee pot and handed one to Eleanor. And they did not talk for a while, which was a language they had developed over 9 years, and which said in this instance something approximately like, "We are here. It is real. Whatever comes next comes from here." Eleanor set down her cup after a while and picked up the hand chisel she had left at the entrance that morning. Samuel watched her move to the wall beside the doorframe. He watched her begin to cut letters into the stone, working slowly and with the same careful precision she brought to every mark she made on rock. The letters were clean and deep and would last longer than either of them. When she stepped back, he read what she had written, 2 lines in the sandstone beside the door that would face south and catch morning light for as long as the overhang held. "The earth endures," it said. "Build with her." He read the last word twice. Her. He looked at her. She looked at the letters and then at the valley below, and then at the mountains which had been there before anyone arrived and would be there after everyone was gone. Her, he said aloud, not quite a question. She answered without looking away from the mountains. "The earth isn't something you stand on. It's someone you make an agreement with." He thought about that for a long time in the quiet that followed, and he thought that he understood her completely, and he also thought that he might spend the rest of his life learning what she had meant. Below them in the White House at the head of the valley, someone lit a lamp in an upstairs window, and the light fell yellow and warm across the painted siding, and for just a moment it looked from 60 feet up and in the last of the dusk like the most solid thing in the world. The first winter in the completed dwelling proved something that Eleanor had calculated but not fully felt until she lived it. Calculation was one language and experience was another, and the two did not always translate cleanly between them. She had known, working from thermal principles in the survey data Samuel had assembled, that the stone walls would retain daytime heat and release it slowly through the night. She had known the south-facing windows would capture winter sun at low angles for several hours each day, even in December. She had known the mass of the cliff behind them would maintain a baseline temperature that no wooden structure in the valley could approach without burning through a season's worth of timber. She had known all of this the way an architect knows a building before it is built, in the abstract, in the numbers, in the confident language of calculation. What she had not known was how it would feel to wake on a January morning with the temperature outside at 22 below zero, and the interior of the stone chamber at 49 degrees, to feel the floor warm under her bare feet from the previous day's sun, to press her palm against the rear wall, and feel the earth behind it breathing its ancient, steady heat into the room. Samuel had placed his thermometer at 5 locations inside the dwelling and checked it every 6 hours from the 1st of November forward, recording the readings in the small, precise columns that had become the organizing principle of his third notebook. The data accumulated through November and December and into January with the patience of accumulating evidence, and what it showed was not merely that the dwelling was warmer than a wooden house, but that it was warmer in a fundamentally different way, not heated from a point source that required constant fuel, but tempered from every surface simultaneously, the walls and floor and ceiling all participating in a thermal conversation with the rock behind them and the sunlight in front of them that made the interior feel less like a house that had been warmed and more like a place that simply was warm, the way the earth a few feet down maintains a temperature that seasons cannot reach. He shared this distinction with Eleanor one evening in February, sitting with his notebooks open on the stone table he had built from a flat piece of sandstone and 2 cut uprights, and she listened to his description with the focused attention she brought to genuinely useful information. The distinction matters, she told him, because it changes what you design for. A house built around a stove is designed around scarcity. Every feature serves to minimize how much heat you lose. A house built the way this one is built is designed around abundance. The heat is already there. You're simply managing it. He wrote that down. He wrote down most of what she said when she was working through an idea, not because she asked him to, but because he had learned that her offhand observations in the evening had a way of turning out to be the essential principle behind everything else. Below them through this winter, Ridgecrest burned wood at the rate that mountain valleys burned it when the buildings were wrong for the climate, which was to say at a punishing rate that had the supply cords dwindling by February and men making trips into the surrounding forest that they had expected to delay until spring. Ashworth's house, with its 6 fireplaces, in its 3 stories, in its Chicago glass that transmitted cold nearly as efficiently as it transmitted light, consumed more wood than any other structure in the valley. The head housemaid, a capable woman named Ruth Hennessy, who had followed the Ashworths from their previous residence in Denver, told Margaret Finch during a supply run to the general store in January that she had never worked in a house where the fires had to be stoked every 2 hours through the night to keep the pipes from freezing. Margaret relayed this to Harold without emphasis, and Harold wrote it in his personal ledger under a heading he had started maintaining called observations, which was where he put information that seemed important without yet being sure why. The social machinery of Ridgecrest continued to operate that winter, with Eleanor outside it. She went to town for supplies on a schedule and spoke to people in the direct, transactional way she had always spoken to people, without apology and without aggression, and most of them responded in kind because face-to-face interaction had its own norms that the performed contempt of group settings suspended. Margaret Finch continued her weekly visits, climbing the goat trail on Thursday mornings with a covered basket that contained whatever she had baked the previous day and staying for an hour or two of conversation that ranged across topics with the unself-conscious range of two intelligent women who had been given limited access to the company they deserved. Eleanor valued these visits more than she acknowledged, partly because Margaret asked useful questions that forced articulation of things Eleanor had left at the level of intuition, and partly because Margaret was one of the few people in the valley who looked at the stone dwelling with neither pity nor derision, but with the open-eyed assessment of someone genuinely trying to understand what she was seeing. Thomas Ashworth arrived in Ridgecrest for the summer in late June of 1880, returned from the boarding school in Denver where Cornelius had enrolled him 3 years prior, on the grounds that the mining town was no place for a boy's education. Thomas was 14, tall for his age in the angular way of boys who are growing faster than they have yet learned to manage, with his father's broad forehead and his mother's habit of watching things carefully before speaking. He spent the first week of his visit in the visible boredom of a boy who has outgrown the entertainments available to him and not yet located the ones he hasn't tried. He rode up the canyon on a borrowed horse. He sat in on an essay demonstration at one of the mines with the expression of someone being polite about information they find uninteresting. He read through his father's collection of mining reports with the look of a person reading a foreign language they have been told they should find interesting. On the 8th day, he walked to the base of the south cliff face and looked up at the stone dwelling, which he had been looking at from a distance since his arrival with a curiosity he had not examined closely enough to act on. From the valley floor, you could see the window frames catching the morning light and the dark line of the overhang above, and on most days, some evidence of activity smoke from the small, baking fire, the occasional figure moving on the ledge, Cedar's Bay flank visible in the stable opening. It looked from below less like a dwelling than like a discovery. Thomas was 14 and had read extensively about everything except what his father considered relevant, and he had a particular sensitivity to the difference between things that were interesting and things that were merely presented as important. He started up the trail. Eleanor was reinforcing a section of the stable wall when he reached the ledge, cutting a precise channel for a timber support she had been fitting for 3 days. She looked up when his head cleared the top of the trail and assessed him with the directness that she applied to everything, then looked back at her work. She did not speak. After a moment, she set down the chisel, picked up a smaller one, and held it toward him. "If you're going to stand there," she told him, "you might as well make yourself useful." She pointed to a section of wall that needed a specific groove cut along the mortar line, a straightforward task that required patience, more than skill, and demonstrated the angle and depth she wanted, and then handed him the chisel and stepped back. He was not immediately good at it. His first pass was too aggressive and skipped across the surface, and his second was too shallow and his third was close. She watched his fourth without comment, which he understood after a moment was a form of approval, and he continued along the section while she returned to her own work. They spent 2 hours this way, working in parallel silence, broken occasionally by her specific technical instruction. The angle wants to follow the grain, not fight it. You're putting force where the stone doesn't want it, and by his questions, which were good questions, the kind that came from someone paying close attention rather than performing interest. He came back 2 days later without being invited, and then again 3 days after that. By mid-July, it had become a pattern that neither of them formally acknowledged Thomas appearing at the top of the trail on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings, Eleanor handing him a task without preamble, both of them working until the midday heat made sustained stonework impractical. She taught him to read the grain, to test for fissures with a tap of the knuckle before committing a chisel line, to understand why the orientation of the dwelling mattered, and what the solar angle data Samuel had been collecting actually demonstrated in practice. He carried a small notebook, blue cloth cover, brass clasp, and wrote in it every evening after he came back to the valley floor, trying to set down in words what he had understood with his hands during the day, which was harder than he expected and more useful than he anticipated. He did not tell his father where he was spending his mornings. This was not a decision he made consciously so much as a conclusion he reached by imagining the conversation and finding it untenable. Cornelius Ashworth's public position on Eleanor Stone's project had not softened over the course of the summer. If anything, it had calcified into something more settled and less examined, the way opinions do when they have been performed publicly enough times that questioning them would require questioning the performances. Thomas was not prepared to introduce that complication. He told his mother he was exploring the canyon, which was true in the way that most of what he told his parents was true accurate at the surface incomplete below it. Clara Ashworth knew more than she indicated. She was a woman who had built a life inside the management of other people's perceptions, which had given her as a side effect an unusually precise ability to read what people were not saying. She noticed the calluses developing on Thomas's palms over the course of July. She noticed the quality of attention he brought to dinner table conversations about construction or materials that he had previously treated with the glazed courtesy of the board. She noticed one evening that he had left his blue notebook on the hall table, and she opened it and read 3 pages and closed it and put it back and went to bed and lay awake for a considerable time thinking about what she had read. She climbed the trail on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of August, timing it to avoid both the hottest part of the day and the hours she knew Thomas was likely to be there. Eleanor was working alone on the ledge, fitting a new piece of oak framing for a secondary window she had been planning to add on the east wall. She looked up when Clara reached the top of the trail and did not appear surprised, which Clara found difficult to interpret and decided to take as welcome. Clara sat down on the stone bench that had been shaped from a natural protrusion. Near the entrance, she noticed it was perfectly angled to catch the afternoon light and looked out at the valley, at her husband's house, 3 stories white, at the head of it, at the grid of smaller structures around it, at the creek threading through the cottonwoods below. Eleanor continued fitting the window frame, while Clara found the words she had climbed 60 feet of cliff face to say. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered territory that neither woman had expected when it began. Clara did not come to apologize. She came because she had read her son's notebook and understood in the specific way of a person who has been carefully not understanding something for a long time that she had been wrong about what Eleanor Stone was doing on the cliff face, and that being wrong about that meant she was probably wrong about other things she had not yet examined. Eleanor did not comfort this realization or make it easier. She answered the questions Clara asked with the directness she brought to all technical explanations, and when Clara's questions moved from the construction into territory that was harder to categorize, why the decision to build here, why the conviction that the stone would hold Eleanor, answered those questions with the same directness, which was more unsettling and more useful than comfort would have been. Clara asked at some point in the second hour whether Eleanor was afraid that her critics were right. Whether she ever lay awake wondering if the whole project was a mistake she was too committed to reverse. Eleanor set down the framing piece and looked at Clara for a moment with the assessing look that Thomas had described in his notebook as the look she used when she was deciding whether a question deserved a real answer. Then she said yes. Some nights, especially in the first winter before the data confirmed what the calculation had predicted. Clara absorbed this. She had expected a denial. The honesty of the admission was more disorienting than confidence would have been because it required her to revise not just her opinion of the project, but her model of the person. Eleanor asked in return whether Clara was afraid. Clara understood that the question was specific, not afraid in general, but afraid of the particular thing Eleanor meant, which was the house below them, the 3-story white cedar structure with its imported marble and its 6 inadequate fireplaces. Clara was quiet for a moment that stretched. Then she said she had never been given permission to be afraid of it. Eleanor said nothing in response to this, which was its own kind of answer. When Clara descended the trail an hour before dinner, she walked back through town to the house with the particular careful stillness of someone carrying something fragile. She did not tell Cornelius where she had been. She did not have a name yet for what the afternoon had changed, but she felt the change the way you feel the first real cold of autumn, not as a temperature, but as the quality of air, a different weight in every breath. She stopped leading the social consensus against Eleanor Stone's inclusion in town gatherings. She did not announce this or explain it. She simply stopped, and the women who had been following her lead found that without her direction, the whole enterprise had less conviction than they had thought, and it subsided the way things subside when the organizing energy withdraws. The summer signals were visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. The elk moved down from the high meadows 6 weeks earlier than usual, coming through the lower canyon in numbers that the old-timers said they had not seen since the bad winter of 1864. The ground squirrels were caching with a frantic intensity that one of the miners, a man named Elias Graves, who had spent 20 years in various mountain camps and developed a weather sense that he described as unreliable but directional, characterized as squirrels that know something we don't. The annual rings on a section of pine that had come down in a summer windstorm were thin to the point that Samuel, who had been reading everything available on natural indicators since October of the previous year, spent an afternoon with a magnifying glass in his notebook recording what the wood had to say about the season just past and what that implied about the season coming. The Ute man came through in October, an elder whose age was somewhere past knowing, traveling south through the canyon with a young companion and a loaded pack animal, following routes that predated the mining road by a margin Samuel estimated at several hundred years at minimum. He stopped at Finch's store for flour and salt and paid with coin, and on his way out he paused beside Eleanor, who was loading her own supply sack. He looked at her for a moment with the direct, unhurried assessment of someone who has been reading terrain his entire life and applies the same skill to people. He said in English that was clear and deliberate, "You live on the rock." She confirmed this. He said, "Good. This winter rock is the only thing still standing." Then he adjusted his pack and walked out into the October afternoon, and his companion followed, and they went south along the canyon without looking back. Eleanor finished loading her sack. She doubled the quantity of flour she had planned to purchase and added a second order of dried beans and bought every remaining spool of lamp wick from Finch's inventory. Harold watched this with the expression he had developed for Eleanor Stone: transactions, attentive, slightly concerned, fundamentally impressed by a quality of decisiveness he associated with people who understood something he didn't. She paid and carried the load to Cedar and rode back up the canyon toward the trail. That evening, she told Samuel about the encounter, and they sat together with her supply inventory and the winter provisions already stored, and calculated how long they could sustain themselves without a trip to town. 8 months at current consumption rates, assuming normal winter. With rationing 10. They looked at each other across the stone table without filling the silence, because what they were both thinking was not about themselves, and both of them knew it. Instead, Samuel went to his notebook and added a column. Danny Holloway appeared at the top of the trail on a Tuesday morning in early November with the slightly embarrassed look of someone who has rehearsed an explanation and knows it's inadequate. His shelter had been taken by a sudden late autumn storm that had come through the canyon faster than the weather typically moved in that direction, collapsing the canvas roof of his sleeping tent and destroying his bedding and most of his food supply. He was 19 and had been working a small placer claim 6 miles up the canyon for 4 months and had the lean economy of someone managing on a very precise budget with no margin. He asked if he could sleep in the stable with Cedar for one night until he sorted himself out. Eleanor told him he could have the storage room, which was warmer, and handed him a bowl of stew. He stayed 3 days. During those 3 days, he asked questions with the relentless curiosity of a person who has been denied access to information he needed and is now trying to make up for lost time. He asked about the water collection system and the thermal mass and the window orientation and the mortar composition and the specific technique for cutting along the sandstone grain. He asked about the thickness of the rear wall and why it was different from the thickness of the side walls and whether the floor angle was intentional. He asked whether Eleanor had designed this herself, and when she said yes, he asked who had taught her. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, working through the implications. Then he said he wanted to learn to build this way. She told him to survive the winter first and come back in the spring. The instruction was so matter-of-fact and so clearly genuine that he held it in mind for the next 4 months as something close to a promise, which it was. The storm arrived on the 2nd of March, 1881, on a morning that looked unremarkable until it didn't. The sky was the particular flat gray of a system moving in rather than passing through the wind, backing from its usual northwest direction to come more nearly from the north, and the temperature dropping in the way that experienced mountain people described as dropping wrong, not gradually with the day's rhythm, but steadily independently, as though the thermometer had been told to go somewhere specific and had stopped consulting the sun about its schedule. By noon, the first snow was falling in horizontal sheets, driven by wind that came down the canyon in sustained gusts. And by 4 in the afternoon, the visibility from the ledge was reduced to the wall of white that had swallowed the valley below. Eleanor stood at the entrance and watched it the way she watched geological events, with full attention and without panic, which was not the absence of fear, but the management of it toward useful purposes. The overhang was doing precisely what it was designed to do. The snow drove past the ledge in curtains that deposited 15 feet in front of the entrance rather than against it. The wind channeled by the cliff face split around the overhang and continued up the canyon without the crushing force it exerted on the exposed structures below. The interior was warm, the water basin was full, the food stores were sufficient. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. What could not be controlled was the valley below where the storm was doing what it was doing. The first 2 days were extraordinary, but not yet catastrophic. Mountain storms of this severity were rare but not without precedent, and the people of Ridgecrest possessed the mountain community's fundamental belief that what nature brought endurance and stubbornness could outlast. The third day changed the register. The snow was accumulating at a rate that exceeded the structural design assumptions of buildings put up quickly by men focused on ore extraction rather than architecture. And by the end of the third day, the lower windows of most structures on the main street were fully covered. By the fifth day, only the upper story windows and the roof lines were visible. And by the fifth evening, 2 roof lines had surrendered to the weight, and the houses below them had become abruptly more dangerous than the storm outside. Harold Finch's chimney blocked on the 5th morning. He was not a young man, and his right hand was reliable, and he made the decision to clear the blockage from the roof rather than from below, because the below approach would have required dismantling the firebox surround he had built the previous summer and was unreasonably proud of. He climbed through the upper window onto the roof with a long-handled brush and found better purchase than he had expected it on the compacted snow, worked his way to the chimney stack, cleared the blockage effectively, and on his way back lost the footing he had found and went down the pitch of the roof in a controlled slide that became uncontrolled at the edge and deposited him 6 feet into the snow, drift below with his right arm underneath him. The arm did not break cleanly. It broke in the way that resists simple setting, the kind of fracture that required a physician's management, and got instead Margaret's hands and whatever she could learn from the medical pamphlet she had ordered from Denver 2 years prior and kept in the kitchen drawer against contingencies. She said it as well as she could. It would heal wrong and remain wrong for the rest of his life, canted slightly from the elbow, in a way that became characteristic, the arm that pointed at the ground at 30 degrees when he meant to point straight. On the 7th day, the Patterson house lost its east wall section. Robert Patterson had built the house himself 4 years earlier with speed and then economy and the specific optimism of a man who was confident the next season would bring enough money to finish it properly, which it had not. And the east wall was the section he had planned to address first when the money arrived. It addressed itself instead at 3 in the morning on the 7th night of the storm, the compromised framing giving way under a load it had never been designed to carry the snow, driving through the gap and filling the lower room in less than a minute. Agnes woke to the sound and had James and Ellen out of their beds and up the ladder to the loft before the cold reached them. Robert arrived at the loft hatch from the lower room with snow to his waist and a look on his face that Agnes would describe afterward as the look of a man who had just had an argument with reality and lost comprehensively. They huddled in the loft for 2 days with the wreckage of the lower room below them, burning chair legs and then table legs, and then the shelf boards Agnes had painted white the previous spring, keeping themselves alive through a combination of physical endurance and the specific warm fury of people who have not yet decided to stop. On the 9th day, Cornelius Ashworth's house declared its own position on the matter. The north wall had been showing stress since the 7th day, producing the low register groaning that timber frame construction produces when the loads exceed calculation, a sound that Ashworth's 2 remaining household staff had been tracking with increasing alarm, while Ashworth himself maintained the conviction that a $12,000 house was adequate to any circumstance Colorado could produce. The conviction held until 2 in the afternoon of the 9th day, when the sound changed from groaning to something more definitive, a sequence of sharp cracks traveling from the roof line down through the wall, framing like a sentence being spoken in a language that required no translation. Clara heard it from the kitchen, where she had moved the family's activities 2 days earlier, partly for warmth and partly from the instinct that the stone kitchen wall she had insisted on during construction offered a qualitatively different kind of safety than the timber rooms above. She had Thomas by the arm before the second crack finished sounding. The north wall and the roof above it came in over the course of 40 minutes, not all at once, but in the progressive way of structures that have reached their limit. First the attic, then the third floor ceiling, then the second floor, each collapse adding to the weight on the floor below until the floors themselves gave way and the house became a series of compressed layers like geological strata. Everything Ashworth had assembled across 3,000 miles of supply chain compressed into a stack of broken timber and burst glass and marble fireplace surrounds that had cost as much as Eleanor's entire construction budget. Ashworth and Clara and Thomas and two household staff stood in the kitchen with their backs against the stone wall Clara had chosen and listened to everything above and around them fall. The kitchen chimney held. The kitchen walls held, as Clara had known they would, because stone holds the way stone holds, without apology and without surprise. The food stores in the kitchen pantry survived intact. They had heat. They had food, they had each other, and they had nothing else. The 15-room house that Ashworth had built to demonstrate the distance between himself and everyone else in Ridgecrest had demonstrated instead something about the relationship between expense and wisdom that he was not yet ready to articulate. On the ledge 60 feet above the valley, Eleanor watched the smoke signature from the Ashworth property with the attention of a person reading a text she did not want to misinterpret. A single chimney meant a single room meant survival, but it meant survival in a space that had not been designed to sustain a family through an extended emergency. She could not see through the storm to know how many people were in that room. She knew only what the single chimney told her, which was enough. She went inside and checked her stores and made a calculation that involved the number of people a space designed for two could shelter if the alternative was freezing, and came up with a number that was uncomfortable in its implications and necessary in its logic. Samuel had already begun inventorying the extra blankets. She saw him doing it and did not ask whether she had asked him to, because the answer was that she had not needed to. The storm continued through the 10th day and the 11th. On the 11th night, in the wrecked kitchen of what had been the finest house in Ridgecrest, Thomas Ashworth sat with a lamp that was running low on oil in his blue notebook and thought about everything Eleanor had told him over the previous summer about the behavior of compacted snow. She had explained it in the context of the overhang, how the weight of accumulated snow created a self-supporting structure under certain conditions, how the compression increased density in a way that paradoxically improved stability, up to a point how the ancient cliff dwellers had understood this well enough to excavate emergency passages through deep snow accumulations without triggering collapse, using the arch principle that the snow itself made available. He looked at the kitchen ceiling, which was holding. He looked at the exterior wall, which was holding. He looked at the space where the door to the hallway had been, which was now a wall of compacted snow that had driven in when the hallway collapsed and sealed the kitchen off from the wreckage beyond. The snow wall was 3 feet thick and extended from floor to ceiling. On the other side of it, somewhere between the kitchen and what had been the front entrance, there might be a path to the surface, or there might be 15 feet of debris and drift with no viable route through. He took the iron fire poker and began to probe the snow wall at a point roughly 18 inches from the ceiling, working carefully at first to test the consistency. The snow was dense but not iced. It had compressed under its own weight, but had not gone through a freeze-thaw cycle, which meant it would cut cleanly rather than fracturing unpredictably. He started a channel at the angle she had described for this kind of excavation, 30 degrees above horizontal, following the arch principle, letting the snow above the channel support itself rather than requiring him to support it. He used the poker and then a large wooden spoon from the kitchen drawer, and then his hands when the channel became narrow enough to fit them. It took 6 hours. Clara held the lamp. Cornelius watched his son work with the expression of a man who has discovered that someone in his house knows something he does not and cannot quite locate the moment when that happened. The channel Thomas cut was 8 inches in diameter, when finished running through the snow wall at precisely the angle required to let outside air in and exhaled air out without the instability that a vertical bore would have created. Cold, clean air moved through it immediately. The quality of breathing in the kitchen changed within 20 minutes. Thomas sat back against the stone wall with his hands scraped raw and his face gray with exhaustion and his blue notebook still in his coat pocket, and he did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. On the 12th morning, the wind stopped. Eleanor was awake before it stopped lying in the sleeping chamber, listening to the silence approach the way you listen to a sound you have been waiting to stop alert to its absence before it fully arrives. When the last sustained gust died in the canyon and the air outside went genuinely still for the first time in 12 days, she was already dressed. She came out onto the ledge and stood in the cold that had not changed. The temperature was still somewhere below zero, the sky still heavy, but the particular violence of the preceding 12 days was over, and in its absence the world was as quiet as a held breath. The valley below was a surface, not a town, not a street, not a grid of buildings with smoke and windows and the sounds of daily life. A surface white and absolute, broken only by the dark geometry of protruding chimneys and the occasional vertical line of something, a fence post, an upper door frame, that the snow had not fully covered. Here and there, a thin thread of smoke rose from points on that surface, each one a calculation. She was already making each one a measure of who was still burning something and therefore still alive. Samuel came out behind her with the ropes she had asked him to prepare 3 days earlier, when she had first understood how the storm was going to end and what ending would require. He had prepared them without being told why, which was the particular form of trust that characterized their partnership, not blind faith, but informed anticipation. His understanding of her logic arriving slightly behind her execution of it, but rarely far enough behind to matter. He carried 4 coils and the hardware for the anchoring system she had installed during construction, the iron rings driven into the cliff face at intervals that she had never explained to him at the time and did not need to explain now. She attached the first rope to the uppermost ring and tested the anchor with her full weight. Then she looked out at the surface of the valley one more time, at the smoke threads, at the silence, at everything the 12 days had made of the town below, and then she put her hands on the rope and began to descend. The surface of the snow held her weight completely. It was like standing on a field of packed earth, the compaction so thorough that her boots barely left impressions. The temperature was somewhere near -15 Fahrenheit, and the light was brilliant in the way that light after a storm is always brilliant, as if the air itself had been scoured clean of everything that used to be between the eye and the sky. She could see the entire surface of the valley, and she could see now that she was on it, the faint discolorations and irregularities that marked where structures lay below. She could read the snow the way she read stone. It told her where to go. She found the Patterson chimney by its smoke, a thin blue thread that meant wet wood and a fire barely maintained, and people using extraordinary effort to keep themselves from the temperature they would become without it. She called down the borehole twice, and on the second call, heard Agnes Patterson's voice come back up from below, hoarse and ragged, and more frightening in its relief than in its distress, the voice of someone who had not been sure anyone would come. Robert called up from below, with the specific practicality of a man who has been waiting to be useful for 12 days. "Tell me what you need me to do on this end." She told him. She and Samuel dug for 6 hours, alternating with the 4 small shovels she had brought down, cutting the shaft at the angle that would allow a person to emerge without the snow wall collapsing above them. Agnes came up first, then Ellen, then James, and last Robert, who came through the opening and stood on the surface of the snow and looked around at the white erasure of everything he recognized and said nothing for a long time. Eleanor did not fill the silence. Some things required the space they required. They brought the Pattersons up the trail before going back for the next chimney. Samuel had organized the interior of the dwelling with the systematic competence that was his specific gift space, allocated supplies, divided the logic of the arrangement clear to everyone who entered it without requiring explanation. Agnes Patterson came through the door and stopped in the middle of the main chamber and pressed one hand against the interior wall and held it there for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling the temperature held within the rock itself, the steady, impossible warmth of a structure that had been built to remember the sun. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They went back down, they found the next chimney. And the next, the work was not heroic in the way that word usually means. It was not fast or dramatic, or conducted in a wash of feeling. It was sustained and physical and methodical. The way all the work Eleanor Stone did was methodical, organized around an understanding of what the problem actually was rather than what it looked like. The problem was cold in depth and time, and the solution was rope and shovels and the willingness to keep moving after the point where stopping felt reasonable. By the end of the first full day after the storm, they had brought 11 people up the trail. By the end of the second day, 23. Samuel had organized the interior into a functional, if extremely dense, temporary settlement, with every horizontal surface that could be slept on serving that purpose, and the food supply rationed with the precision of his notebooks and the logic of a man who understood exactly how many days the stores could carry, how many people if everyone ate the minimum required to maintain the body heat they needed to survive. He had a list. He always had a list. The list kept 43 people alive in a house built for two, and it was the most important thing he had ever written. On the fourth day after the storm, Eleanor reached the site of the Ashworth house. There was no chimney visible above the snow surface at the location where it should have been, which meant either the chimney had collapsed with the house or it would buried below the current surface level, which given the depth of accumulation in the valley floor was possible. She stood on the surface and calculated and then moved 12 feet west and probed with a rod and found timber at 4 feet depth, moved again, probed again, found stone at a depth that matched the kitchen floor level, and began to dig. Samuel was beside her. They did not speak while they worked. The shovels bit into the compacted snow with a sound that was all they needed to hear. An hour into the excavation, she heard it the sound of knocking. Not the random knocking of settling debris, but a pattern deliberate and rhythmic, 2 beats and a pause and 2 beats again repeated. She knocked back twice and put her ear to the shaft. The knocking below stopped. Then it resumed differently faster with the specific cadence of excitement, not distress. She recognized, without being able to articulate how she recognized it, that the person below knew exactly what they were doing and had known someone would come. 3 hours more. The shaft opened. Light fell into the kitchen from above and struck the stone wall, and the faces of 5 people who had been in the dark for 2 days since their lamp oil ran out. And the first face through the opening was Thomas Ashworth, scraped and gray and completely alert. And the first thing he said, squinting into the light, I used the arch method. It held. She looked at the borehole visible in the snow wall behind him. 8 inches 30 degrees precisely correct. She said, I know. She didn't know. But the confidence in her voice was not a performance. It was the confidence of someone who has taught something real and understood in this moment that it had been learned. Cornelius Ashworth came through the shaft opening last. He stood on the snow surface, and the light hit him in the way that light after 12 days of darkness hits a person total and indiscriminate, revealing everything. He was 60 feet below the stone dwelling where Eleanor Stone had lived undamaged through all of it. He could see it above him on the cliff face, its windows intact, its overhang clear, its entrance exactly where it had always been. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Eleanor's hand extended toward him, and he looked at her face, which was offering nothing except the practical fact of the hand. He took it. They started up the trail together, not speaking, the snow holding under their feet, the sun moving in its low winter arc toward the western peaks. The accounting came in April when the snow had pulled back far enough to reveal what it had covered, and what it had covered was the end of Ridgecrest as it had existed before the 2nd of March. Every timber structure in the valley had sustained damage ranging from severe to total. The 2 saloons were rubble. The assay office had lost its roof in one wall and stood open to the sky like a building in the process of being demolished. The Methodist church, which had been the most substantial wooden structure on the main street, had collapsed entirely except for its stone-belt tower, which rose from the wreckage with an almost pointed dignity, as though making a specific argument about material choices. Of the 41 residential structures that had stood in the valley on the morning the storm began, 6 retained enough structural integrity to be considered habitable, and of those 6, 4 required significant repair before any reasonable person would choose to live in them through another winter. Harold Finch walked the main street on the first clear morning with his arm in the canvas sling Margaret had fashioned and his ledger under his good arm, and made notes with the mechanical steadiness of a man who has decided that the only available response to catastrophe is documentation. He recorded the status of every structure on both sides of the street and then walked the residential lanes beyond and recorded those and then walked to the edge of the valley and turned and looked at the whole of it from a distance, the broken roof lines and the exposed interiors and the debris that the melting snow was beginning to give back to visibility. And he wrote in the ledger a single line that was not an inventory item, but an observation we built for the good years and the mountains sent a bad one. He underlined it once, which was the most editorial emphasis he had ever applied to anything in an official document, and closed the ledger and walked back to his office, which was one of the 6 habitable structures. 21 people had not come through it. The number settled over the community in the weeks after the storm, with the specific weight of a number that cannot be distributed into abstraction. 14 who had frozen in structures that failed them. 5 who had died from smoke when blocked chimneys turned their shelters against them. 2 who had been in the Patterson Lane when the first roof came down on the 6th night and had not been found until the snow withdrew in March. Eleanor knew each name. Samuel had kept the list from the beginning, adding to it as information came in from the rescue operations and from the survivors who emerged with accounts of those who had not. He kept the list in a separate notebook from his temperature data and his construction notes, a small one with a black cover that he put on the shelf beside the others, but never opened casually, only when he needed to add to it or when he needed to remember that the numbers had faces. The gathering at the base of the South Cliff happened organically without formal organization on a morning in the first week of April when the snow had receded enough to expose the flat ground where the main street met the canyon wall. Someone no one later remembered who said that they needed to talk, and the word moved through the temporary shelters in the 6 habitable houses and the stone dwelling above, and by 9 in the morning, approximately 260 people had assembled in the cold April air in the shadow of the cliff face where Eleanor Stone's house remained exactly as it had been on the 1st of March, its window frames intact, its entrance, clear of the inscription beside the door readable from the valley floor if you knew where to look. There was no podium. There was no formal arrangement of speakers. There was the crowd and the cliff and the morning light, and Clara Ashworth standing at the edge of the group near the front with her hands clasped and the expression of someone who has been preparing for something she is not sure she is ready for. She did not wait to be introduced or invited. She stepped forward, and the crowd adjusted around her in the way crowds adjust around people who have decided to move. And when she spoke, her voice carried in the cold air with a clarity that the canyon amplified. She had spent the previous evening working through what she intended to say with the same methodical care she had once applied to planning dinner parties, which was the skill she had available and which she directed for the first time in a long time towards something that mattered. 7 or 8 months ago, Clara told them she had climbed the trail to the stone dwelling on the cliff face without telling her husband where she was going. She had gone because she had read something her son had written and understood that she had been systematically misunderstanding what Eleanor Stone was doing, and that this misunderstanding had not been accidental. She had found it useful. It had kept certain structures intact that her position depended on. A woman who built differently than the accepted way threatened the idea that the accepted way was correct, and the accepted way, being correct, was connected in ways she had not examined until she sat in a stone room that was warmer than any room in the valley and looked out at her husband's expensive and inadequate house, to a great many other things she preferred not to examine. She paused. The crowd was entirely still. The canyon held the silence the way it held cold completely and without effort. What happened in that room, Clara continued, was that she asked Eleanor Stone whether she was afraid her critics were right, and Eleanor said yes, some nights. And then Eleanor asked Clara whether she was afraid of her own house, and Clara had said she had never been given permission to be afraid of it. She looked out at the assembled faces of Ridgecrest people she had organized and led, and in some cases subtly excluded for 3 years. I had given myself permission to be afraid of a great many things, she told them, but not of that one. Because being afraid of it would have required me to say that my husband might be wrong about something important, and I had decided a long time ago that was not a fear I was allowed to have. She turned and looked up at the cliff face at the stone dwelling that had sheltered 47 people through the worst storm in the valley's recorded history without sustaining damage to a single structural element. My husband is not a foolish man, she said, but he was wrong about this. And I knew it before the storm, and I did not say so, and I have to live with that, the same way everyone here has to live with the choices they made before the 2nd of March. The difference is that I am saying it out loud because I think we owe each other that kind of honesty. Now, if we're going to build something worth building. Cornelius Ashworth had been standing at the edge of the crowd with the specific stillness of a man who has been told something true in public and is deciding in real time how to receive it. His face over the course of Clara's remarks had moved through several expressions that were not performances. This was the thing that registered with the people watching him, that the emotions crossing his face were not being managed for effect, but were simply occurring, which was not a quality they associated with him. When Clara finished, he stood in the silence for a moment, and then he moved to where she was standing and placed his hand briefly on her shoulder and stepped forward. He had lost weight in the weeks since the storm. The cold that had damaged his face in the kitchen had left a tightness around his jaw that would be permanent, a slight pulling of the chin that made his expressions sharper than they had been. He looked standing before the crowd, less like the man who had commanded the room at the assay office, and more like someone who had been through something that had reorganized his priorities without asking permission. He did not begin with an apology. He began with a fact. The house cost $12,000, he told them. He had wanted them to know that number, and he had made sure they did. He had thought the number meant something about judgment, that a man who could spend $12,000 on a house had the judgment to spend it correctly. On the 8th day of the storm, the north wall came in, and on the 9th day, the floors above went down, and his family spent the last 3 days of the storm in a kitchen with one lamp, and no certainty that anyone knew where they were or that anyone was coming. He stopped. He looked at the ground for a moment, which was something the people who knew him had not seen him do. The house is gone, he said. $12,000 of someone else's forest and someone else's stone and someone else's glass. None of it from this ground, none of it understanding this ground. He looked up. My son spent the 11th night cutting a ventilation channel through a snow wall using a fire poker and a kitchen spoon because a woman I called foolish had spent a summer teaching him how compacted snow behaves under load. We breathed through a hole my 14-year-old cut with a spoon, and we are alive because of it. The specific weight of this landed differently than a polished acknowledgement would have. It was too particular, too strange, too clearly true to function as rhetoric. He did not say he was sorry in those words. He said that he had spent 3 years making it harder for Eleanor Stone to do her work, and that in his considered view, the 21 people whose names Samuel had in his black notebook deserved better from him than the entertainment he had provided at their expense in the saloon on the night he made the wager. He said this without theatrical emotion, which made it more difficult to hear than emotion would have been because it left no distance between the statement and its weight. Eleanor was standing at the back of the crowd with Samuel beside her, and she waited until the space opened for her to speak, which it did without anyone directing it. The crowd simply made room in the way that crowds make room for the person the conversation has been about. She walked to the front and stood where Clara and Cornelius had stood and looked at the assembled people of Ridgecrest with the directness she brought to everything, which some of them were seeing for the first time, without the filter of the performed consensus that had preceded the storm. She did not address Ashworth's remarks directly. She said, I built the house on the cliff because my father taught me that stone remembers what wood forgets, and I wanted to build something worth remembering. I did not build it to be right. I built it because it was the best answer I knew to the question of how to live in this canyon through a Colorado winter. And I believe then, and I believe now, that the best answer available is the one you're obligated to build. Then she said the thing she had not said in 3 years of being excluded and refused and publicly wagered against, not because she had been suppressing it, but because she had not been ready to say it in a context where it was useful, rather than merely defensive. She said, I am a stonemason. I was trained as one by my father, who was the best I ever knew. And I have practiced the trade for 30 years, and I was not permitted to practice it under my own name until I came here and bought $18 of cliff face that nobody else wanted. I am telling you this now not to ask for sympathy, but because if we are going to rebuild this town correctly, you need to know who in this valley actually knows how to build with stone, and you need to be willing to listen to her. The silence that followed was the kind that contains a reckoning. Not everyone in the crowd had known that she had been turned away from the hardware suppliers. Not everyone had known about the Thursday sewing circle. Not everyone had put together the full shape of what the 3 years had looked like from her side of it. Some of them had participated in pieces of it without thinking of the pieces as a whole. Standing in April sunlight with the debris of the storm still visible on three sides, some of them were thinking about that for the first time. Samuel spoke once briefly near the end. He was not a man who sought the front of a room, and he came forward with the slightly reluctant air of someone who has something specific to contribute and is willing to contribute it and nothing more. He said that he had been keeping records of temperature and material performance and construction costs since the autumn of 1878, and that the records were complete and available, and that anyone who wanted to understand the thermal behavior of the stone dwelling versus the timber structures in the valley before deciding how to rebuild was welcome to come and look at the numbers. He said this with the matter-of-fact quality of someone offering to lend a book. Then he stepped back. Several people moved toward him immediately. The question of how to rebuild Ridgecrest was not resolved at the April gathering. It was open there, which was a different thing and more important. What followed was 3 years of argument and experiment and the particular social negotiation of a community trying to change the terms on which it operates without having a clear model for what the new terms should look like. Eleanor Stone was at the center of this, not because she sought the center, but because she had the knowledge and the demonstrated track record that the rebuilding required, and the combination made her unavoidable in a way that her competence alone had not managed in the 3 years before the storm. The first new construction began in May of 1881 before the full snowmelt was complete because the urgency was real and the season was short and there was no practical alternative to beginning. Eleanor worked with 8 volunteers who had come to Samuel in the days after the gathering and been handed the beginning of what would become over the following months the closest thing to a formal curriculum that she had ever produced. She taught them the bore test and the grain reading and the principles of thermal mass and south orientation, and Samuel documented every session in a new notebook that he had purchased specifically for this purpose, a larger one with ruled pages and a red cloth cover that he kept on the stone table in the main chamber and added to every evening. The work was slower than timber construction would have been. This was the central argument of the people who wanted to rebuild the way they had built before that winter was coming again. That timber went up in days where stone took weeks, that the town needed shelter faster than the stone method could provide it. Eleanor's response to this argument was consistent and patient, and did not change regardless of how many times she was required to give it. A timber house, built in days that fails in winter, is slower than a stone house built in weeks that stands for a century. The argument was not universally persuasive. Some residents chose timber for the speed. Eleanor did not obstruct them. She continued building stone. Ashworth resolved the question of his own contribution in a way that no one anticipated and that he appeared to arrive at without discussion. He came to Eleanor 3 weeks after the April gathering and told her that he wanted to fund the construction of a community hall large enough to shelter the entire population of Ridgecrest if a storm like the March one recurred. He wanted it built into the east cliff face using the principles she had developed. He wanted to work on it himself with his hands doing whatever she told him to do. He said this without ornamentation. She looked at him for a moment and then said that she would need a mortar mixer and that it was heavy work and that she would not make allowances for the fact that he had not done this kind of work before. He said he understood. She handed him a mixing paddle the following Monday morning and put him to work, and that was how Cornelius Ashworth, who had spent 3 years performing his wealth for the people of Ridgecrest, spent the summer of 1881 learning what his hands were capable of when his ego was not directing them. He was not immediately capable of much. He mixed mortar badly for the first week and adequately for the second and reasonably well by the third. And he asked questions without the defensive overlay that had characterized his engagement with ideas he didn't control. And he carried stone and held frames and learned to read Eleanor's silences the way everyone who worked with her eventually learned to read them as information rather than absence. Clara came to watch on several occasions and brought lunch, and on one afternoon, she sat beside Agnes Patterson while Agnes was working on the interior wall finishing, and they talked for 2 hours about things they had not talked about before, which included the Thursday sewing circle and the hardware suppliers and the specific texture of those 3 years. Agnes did not perform anger about it, She did not perform forgiveness either. She said what she thought and Clara listened, which was the beginning of something. Thomas returned to school in Denver in the fall of 1881 with the blue notebook in his bag and a working knowledge of sandstone construction that he had assembled through a summer, a season of private study, and 11 nights in a failing kitchen, with nothing to do but think about what he had learned. He pursued engineering with the single-mindedness of someone who has already seen the field applied to its most important question and knows what answers look like. He wrote to Eleanor regularly letters that were more technical than personal questions about specific material behaviors, requests for Samuel's temperature data from particular months, proposals for calculation approaches that he wanted her to evaluate. She answered all of them with the directness she brought to all technical communication, correcting where he was wrong and confirming where he was right, and occasionally adding a sentence at the end that was not technical, but that Thomas came to look for the way you look for the key line in a complicated text. Danny Holloway came back in the spring, as he had said he would, and Eleanor held him to the terms she had offered: real instruction, real work, real standards. He was a quick learner in the specific way of people who have been paying attention to things their whole lives without having language for what they were observing, and the language Eleanor gave him connected to the observation almost immediately. Within 3 months, he was working independently on sections of the community hall that Eleanor judged him ready for. Within 6 months, she trusted him with decisions she had previously reserved for herself. By the end of 1882, she told him with the economy she applied to all significant statements that he was a stonemason. He wrote the word down in the small notebook he had started keeping in imitation of Samuel and looked at it for a while and then put the notebook in his coat pocket. Samuel finished the first draft of what would become the manual in the winter of 1882, sitting at the stone table with the lamp on and Eleanor reading in the chair across from him, while the temperature outside dropped to 20 below and the interior remained at its steady 52 degrees without a fire. The draft ran in 90 pages and covered site assessment and material selection and thermal calculation and water management and the specific techniques Eleanor had developed for cutting sandstone cleanly at various grain orientations. He read sections of it aloud to Eleanor, and she corrected and added and occasionally stopped him to demonstrate something that the words were not capturing accurately, picking up a chisel and showing what the sentence was attempting to describe. He wrote the demonstrations into the text. The manual grew. The community hall was completed in the fall of 1882, and the town gathered in it for the first time in November. The whole of Ridgecrest's 300 and some souls inside a structure that was 60 feet wide and 30 deep, cut into the east cliff face with the natural stone, making the back wall and the roof partially supported by the overhang above the whole thing oriented to catch the low winter sun through the long south-facing window wall that Eleanor had insisted on over the objections of the people who thought windows in winter were an argument for cold rather than against it. The interior was warm. The gathering went long. People stayed longer than they intended, the way people stay in places that feel fundamentally right without being able to articulate exactly what they mean by that. Cornelius Ashworth was there sitting with Clara in the middle of the crowd, and at one point during the evening, Eleanor happened to be near him, and he said, without preamble and without the rhetorical weight of an occasion, "I keep thinking about the wager. The $500. She looked at him without filling the space. He said, "I want to pay it. Not to you, I understand you'd tell me to keep it. To the building fund or whatever serves the town." He was not asking permission. He was describing what he had decided. She said the school needs a new roof, stone this time. He said he'd arrange it. They were standing in the community hall he had funded, and she had designed in a town they had both helped to rebuild, and neither of them mentioned any of that because it was already contained in the conversation they were having. The way the heat from 3 days of good sun is already contained in stone when you press your hand against it at midnight. The phrase that attached itself to the rebuilding work moved through the valley and then beyond it without anyone formally deploying it. Build like the stones was not something Eleanor or Samuel ever said about their own work. It emerged from the people who had learned from them, and from the people who had seen the results, and from travelers and miners who passed through Ridgecrest in the years after the storm, and noticed that the town looked different from other Colorado mining communities, not grander or more polished, but more deliberate, as though each structure had been placed with an understanding of where it was. The phrase reached other mountain communities, the way useful information always travels through the specific person who had been somewhere and seen something and could not stop talking about it, and in each new place it arrived as a description of a method and became over time a description of an attitude. The Rocky Mountain News sent a reporter to Ridgecrest in the spring of 1884, a man named Cartwright who had been assigned what his editor described as a human interest piece about the cliff-dwelling mining town, and who arrived expecting local color and found instead Eleanor Stone explaining the relationship between solar angle and thermal mass with the aid of Samuel's years of temperature data spread across the stone table. He had expected his later account made clear to find a man at the center of what he had come to write about. He managed the adjustment with professional competence, though not before a moment of visible recalibration that Eleanor observed without comment. She handed him Samuel's notebooks when he asked to see the technical documentation. Then she handed him the hand chisel she had been using that morning and held it out until he took it. The chisel and the notebooks together, she told him, neither one is the story without the other. He wrote about both. He wrote about Eleanor Stone as an engineer, which was the first time that word had been applied to her in print, and about Samuel Stone as the systematic observer whose records made the engineering legible to anyone who hadn't felt it through their hands. The piece ran in April and was reprinted in 2 other Colorado papers and in a mining industry journal that reached readers in Utah and New Mexico, and it described the Ridgecrest approach to mountain construction in terms precise enough to be useful and vivid enough to be read by people who did not think they were interested in construction until they were halfway through the piece and found that they were. Thomas's letters continued through the middle years of the decade with the regularity of someone who has found a correspondence that matters. His questions became more sophisticated as his training progressed, moving from the specific and practical toward the theoretical, and then in a way that pleased Eleanor, and that she mentioned to Samuel one evening back toward the practical from a different angle, the mark she thought of someone who was actually learning rather than merely accumulating information. He came back to Ridgecrest in the summer of 1885 for the first time since leaving for school and spent 6 weeks working alongside Eleanor and Danny Holloway on a residential commission 3 miles up the canyon, a family who had read the Rocky Mountain News piece and written to Eleanor asking whether she would design and oversee construction of their home. He ate dinner with Eleanor and Samuel every evening and asked questions the way he had always asked questions, with the quality of attention that made the person being asked feel that the answer genuinely mattered. The manual was published in 1893 through a Denver printer who had been recommended by Cartwright. Samuel had revised it 4 times since the first draft, incorporating additional techniques that Eleanor had developed through the years of continued work, adding sections on regional variation and sandstone composition across the Colorado high country, expanding the thermal calculation chapter to include data from the 14 years of continuous temperature records he had maintained. He titled it simply The Stonehouse Manual and listed himself as the author on the cover page. On the title page facing the cover, in the position where publishers place dedication language, he had written, "The methods described in this volume are the work of Eleanor Stone, stonemason of Ridgecrest, Colorado. The text is mine. The knowledge is hers." She read this when the first printed copy arrived and said nothing immediately, and then after a longer pause than Samuel expected, "You should have asked me." He said she would have told him to take it out. She was quiet again, and then she said yes. He said he knew. She looked at the page for another moment, and then she set the book down and went back to the drawing she had been working on, and he understood from the particular quality of her return to work that she was not displeased, which with Eleanor Stone was his own significant statement. The manual went through 3 printings. The 3rd printing in 1897 reached readers in communities across the Mountain West, and the letters that came back to the Denver printer and were forwarded to Samuel described specific buildings in specific places: a schoolhouse in a Utah Canyon town, a community shelter in a New Mexico mining settlement, a farmhouse in a Colorado valley 40 miles from Ridgecrest that had been built using the methods the manual described. Danny Holloway wrote from the town in southern Colorado where he had been working for 2 years to say that he had given copies to 3 other builders there, and that 2 of them had used them on projects that winter, and that both buildings had come through a difficult January without damage that their neighbors' structures had not avoided. He wrote, "Every one I build, I put a mark in the corner. 3 letters. It says, 'Who taught me?'" Harold Finch wrote in the journal he had begun keeping after the storm, a more personal document than his office ledger started in the winter of 1881, when he had found that the events of the previous year had left him with more to process than official documentation could hold, that he had been thinking about the transaction of April 1878, in which he had recorded the sale of $18 of Cliff Face to Eleanor Stone, with the private conviction that he was documenting a mistake. He wrote that he now understood he had been present at the most significant land transaction in the county's history, not because of the price or the acreage, but because of what was done with the land, and that the $18 represented the largest return on investment per dollar spent of anything he had recorded in 30 years of keeping records. He underlined this line, making it one of only 2 underlined lines in his entire journal. A frequency of emphasis he applied to nothing else in his life. Clara Ashworth became, in the years following the storm, something that she had not been before, a person with a position she had arrived at through examination rather than inheritance. She joined the rebuilt school board and advocated for the natural science curriculum that Samuel had developed, which included the geological and observational components he had added after the storm. And she was more effective in this advocacy than anyone expected, because she had the combination of social authority and genuine conviction. That is the most persuasive thing available to a human being. She and Agnes Patterson worked together on the school board for 11 years, which was a collaboration that neither of them would have predicted in 1880, and that both of them in retrospect described as one of the better things to come out of the worst experience of their lives. Cornelius Ashworth did not rebuild his 3-story white cedar house. He built instead a 2-story stone house against the east cliff face, designed by Eleanor, with 7 rooms and a south-facing window wall and thermal mass in the rear wall that kept it at a steady temperature through the coldest nights, without the 6 fireplaces the cedar house had required and failed to make adequate. He lived in it for the rest of his life. He was a changed man in the way that people are changed by experiences that cost them something real, not continuously performing his transformation, not using it as a new form of social capital, but simply proceeding differently through the days available to him, as though the recalibration was complete, and the task now was just to live according to it. Thomas finished his engineering studies and wrote his thesis on the thermal performance of mass construction in high-altitude mountain environments, using Samuel's temperature records as his primary data set and Eleanor's construction methods as his central case study. He sent the first copy to Eleanor with a note that said, among other things, that he had understood for the first time sitting in the kitchen on the 11th night of the storm and working the ventilation channel through the snow wall, that the thing he wanted to spend his life doing was the thing she had spent her life doing, understanding what materials could do and then doing it. He built a practice in Denver and spent 30 years designing structures across the Mountain West. And every significant project he completed had somewhere in its construction documents a notation that traced back to the principles in Samuel's manual and Eleanor's cliff face, and the summer sessions on the ledge that his father had not known about and would not have permitted if he had. Eleanor and Samuel Stone lived in the dwelling on the south cliff face for 36 years after its completion, which was longer than most of the people who had watched its construction expected. The work continued through most of those years, commissions and consultations, and the teaching that was never formally organized as teaching, but that produced over 3.5 decades, somewhere in the range of 40 people who could call themselves stonemasons and who cited Eleanor Stone as the source of what they knew. Samuel continued his records through 1912, 33 years of continuous temperature data from 5 locations in the dwelling, a document that was eventually deposited at the Colorado Geological Survey, and that researchers cited decades later when they were trying to understand how vernacular architecture in the Mountain West had managed thermal performance, that modern buildings with more advanced materials sometimes failed to match. Eleanor died in January of 1915 in the stone sleeping chamber in the 81st year of her life, with the sound of the winter wind moving over the cliff above, but not reaching the interior where she lay, the walls around her, holding their temperature the way they had always held it, without drama, without fluctuation, with the steady reliability of something that has understood its purpose for a very long time. She died with Samuel beside her, and with the particular quality of completion that belongs to people who spent their lives on the right work. Samuel died in March of the same year, 7 weeks after Eleanor, in the same room of no specific medical cause that the physician could identify beyond the general proposition that some people do not survive certain absences. Thomas Ashworth, who came from Denver for both services, wrote to a colleague afterward that Samuel Stone had been one of the most useful people he had ever known. Useful in the specific sense of a person who understands what they contribute and contributes it fully, who does not confuse the supporting role with the lesser role, who makes the central work possible through the quality of his attention and the steadiness of his presence. He wrote that Eleanor Stone had been a genius in the specific technical sense of the word, and also in the older sense, the sense of a person for whom the work and the self were not separable. He wrote that he was not sure Ridgecrest would have survived the storm of 1881 without the two of them together, and that he was certain the town that emerged from it would not have been what it was. The dwelling was acquired by the state of Colorado in 1923 and designated a historic site, and the designation came in part because of Samuel's records and in part because of the community's own insistence. The people of Ridgecrest, and then their children, and then their children's children, had maintained a specific relationship to the site that was less like tourism and more like obligation, the recognition that the place had earned its standing through performance rather than sentiment. The inscription beside the entrance remained exactly as Eleanor had cut it on the August evening in 1879, when the work was complete and the night was clear. The earth endures. Build with her. The sandstone around the letters had weathered at the edges over the decades, softening the angles slightly, giving the inscription the quality of something very old, which it was. Below it, in smaller letters that showed a different hand, precise and regular, where Eleanor's were bold, careful where hers were confident, were the words Samuel had cut into the stone in the weeks between her death and his own working slowly with the smallest chisel in her kit, because he wanted to do it correctly, and he understood that doing it correctly would require time. She was always the wiser of the two. He signed it with his initials and the year, and set the chisel down on the ledge, and sat for a while in the April afternoon, with the south-facing wall warm at his back, and the canyon spread out below him, the town rebuilt and standing the cliff faces on both sides, holding their houses, the creek running where it had always run the mountains, where they had always been.